Welcome to the lectures that are going to look at the concept of creativity and how we define it and where that sits in the different approaches that are related to this module. We need to start with thinking about what creativity is. We all have different concepts of creativity and it's really difficult to narrow it down. Some of the greatest minds spend a very long time thinking about these topics. But really, creativity is a unique thing, but also something that can be very hard to pin down. So Stam in 2008 decided that creativity itself was coming up with an idea. So when you come up with an idea, that's you being creative. Henry said, well, that's great, but actually, if your idea is just someone else's, that's not good. So we're looking for novel and original things that haven't been said before. But then Besant and Tidd, who write the core textbook for this, says basically creativity is about the making and communication of meaningful new connections. So they transpose the idea of just an idea into this concept of creating connections, but then also moving it on and talking about how does it add value to the individual, to the group, the organisation or society. So for them, it wasn't just the idea, the output is a valid part of the approach. So having this idea of creativity defined, the next thing to start thinking about is where does it come from? And it's a really interesting point. What makes some people more creative than others? What means that you can be a more creative person? And one of the things we need to think about is maybe the source of creativity and how can we stimulate that, especially in a sort of working environment. Traditionally, there was this concept that creativity was a gift from God. This is this idea of a genius that is struck by lightning or has a light bulb moment. So the photo there is a very famous one called, I think it's when God touches Adam, I can't remember what it's called, and it's a spark of creation. And so it's this concept that the God comes down and gives you this spark of creativity which creates your ideas. And we talk about this idea of a creative genius as well. Now that's a fantastic approach, but the reality is not all of us are going to be touched by God, not all of us are going to be creative geniuses, but does that mean that we can't be creative generally? And I disagree that it does. I think we can all be creative, and I think it's about ways of finding that. So this old-fashioned view has moved on and become something else. So if it isn't from God, where does it come from? We think it has this age-old dilemma of nature versus nurture. This is a debate that goes on in psychology and sociology often. If you haven't heard about it, you have the idea of nature and then you have the idea of nurture. Nature means that it's a genetic approach. It's hard-coded in who we are. You can't change whether you're created. If you are born with this ability to write music like Mozart, then it's not something that you can teach to someone else in a different time. So therefore, you can't take an uncreative person and make them creative. Conversely, if someone is very creative, then almost because it's a genetic approach, you can't make them less creative. Because not all creativity is a good thing. The opposite side to this is this idea of a nurture. And nurture means about how you are brought up, culturally, socially, what your background is, your education. There's lots of studies into how we bring up children. Some of them encourage just reducing boundaries to allow creative exploration, curiosity, because we think these are things that will help people be creative in the future. And creativity itself has a huge value in society. Humankind developed because of new and novel inventions throughout. So this debate is really important, because if it's a nature approach, then we shouldn't waste our time trying to make people that aren't creative. We should invest our money in those that are. Alternatively, if it's about nature, then surely we should shouldn't be putting everyone into a creative environment, and this way we can maximize the creativity of all the people that go through it. So it has a big influence, and again, you may sit on one side or the other. Personally, I think it's a blend of the two things. I think it's not a gift from God, but it's a bit creating a nurture, nurturing environment, and then you have to have some natural ability that goes with it. So if it isn't this touched by God or creative genius, where can we get creative ideas from? Well, fundamentally, there's a few different ways. The first one is we can start thinking about things and it can be an accident. So the first thing is that we can come up with creative ideas or creative concepts through an accident. The idea that something happens, or penicillin was discovered because a tray wasn't cleaned out properly. These accidents happen, there's so many coincidences, and actually the genius or the creative element comes from spotting the differences and seeing how that could be moved somewhere else. So an accident could be a different approach. The challenge with taking an approach that creativity only comes about by accident is that you could just sit there waiting for it. So you do find that some people try to create accidents by doing a lot of things, indulging in different activities to see if that will stimulate things in a different way. Another way to develop creativity is about thinking, starting to think about problems in different ways, just sitting down and taking the time to analyse things, conceptualising concepts and sharing them in your head to think about, okay, how does this work? So creativity or creative thinking comes from thinking, this concept of creating time. In the modern world, time is something that is valued highly. So how often do we have the ability to sit down and creatively think or work on it? The next approach is association. The idea that if we bump into each other, we have conversations and we socially interact with each other, these associations create links perhaps that didn't exist before. You see this in organisations talking about formal and informal approaches and networks that exist. Association is what's led places like Google to try and encourage people to have conversations in the corridors, to mix them up, get people to sit next to each other at lunch, all of this, because these creative associations allow for ideas to develop that wouldn't happen naturally. Growing up, one of the ways that we approach things is we have a concept of linear thinking. This is this idea where we take a data A, we apply our knowledge, beliefs, behaviour, biases, and it gives us a reaction B. For example, if someone tells us that they are about to get married, we know that society thinks that this is a good thing to do, so we are likely to congratulate them. So linear thinking follows a set of rules that we can apply to any situation and gives us this idea of an input, we translate it, and it gives us an output. So for example, we might look at, we want to launch a new flavour of soft drink. We might look at the flavours we got, we might look at what's most popular now and maybe make it around that flavour but with a little twist. So it might be Coca-Cola with lemon. That is a form of linear thinking. We are very linear in what we do. The good thing about that is it tends to be low risk. The bad thing is that anyone else can do it. It's a very easy thing to do when people state the obvious or follow the same thing. And there are two other types of thinking. We'll go into these next. But first I have a big question for you. So, hopefully you haven't heard this before, but we'll give you some time for this. The question for you is, how do you put an elephant in the fridge? Think about it. Think about how would you get an elephant in the fridge. You can say it out loud or you can think about how it approaches, and we'll go on from there. Well, hopefully you came up with some interesting ideas. Often people talk about stuffing it in, chopping it up, having a massive fridge, all of this. But the reality is, if you take the data that I've given you, which is we've got an elephant and we've got a fridge, is you just open the door and put her in. You're assuming that the elephant won't fit in the fridge, or you're assuming that the fridge is smaller than the elephant, or whatever your assumptions are. And that's part of linear thinking. It's this concept of basing everything that we've done on what we've previously experienced. If we've had experience of elephants, we've had experience of fridges, we probably recognise that fridges are smaller than elephants. But that wasn't part of the data set that I gave you. So creativity is about thinking about things in different ways. And this allows us to actually think about when you get to a hurdle, linear thinking often will get to a problem and stop, because it will only have one way of thinking about things. For example, if your job was to put an elephant in the fridge, you might give up because you might say, well, the problem is an elephant won't fit in the fridge. And that's where you move on to the concept of lateral thinking. How can you get round this problem, whether it be self-imposed or you found it a different way? How do you move on and find a different solution? So for example, in that case, you open the fridge and you put them in. This should give you a clearer example of lateral thinking. Here we're playing a game of noughts and crosses and it looks like a draw, apart from someone's done a circle down on the right hand side. Well, if you haven't explicitly agreed the instructions up front, what stops people doing it? Well, we have a social conscious or bias towards the rules are that you must put them in the grids, but if no one's told you not to, and you're a lateral thinker, then you can break the rules. And this is almost this idea of thinking out of the box, thinking in a different way to try and be creative and come up with solutions. And so once you've done this idea of lateral and linear thinking, you also can do divergent and convergent. And this is really key to moving on from a definition of creativity and thinking about how you can apply it. Divergent thinking is about creating lots of options to try and stimulate discussion or stimulate outputs. So for example, you might have a brainstorming session which allows you to create lots of ideas. Then you might apply convergent thinking, which is where you look at those ideas and you narrow them down and make some choices around what you think works. So it's important from that point to think about you've got linear thinking and lateral thinking, divergent and convergent. All of these things are part of doing it. We've defined what creativity is. We've shown you some ways to start thinking about creativity. So if you want, a good thing to do now is to reflect on your creative ability, because that then can go as part of your assessment.